Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping softly into the quiet moments that shape the very heart of a world so different, yet so familiar from our own. Imagine a village where the day's struggles don't end with sunset, where fear and hope mingle in the cold night air, and where the fate of families rests on the watchful eyes of a few brave souls. This is the world of feudal France, a place where every night was a battle against shadows both real and imagined. It's a story of courage, endurance, and the invisible threads that hold a community together when the darkness falls. Tonight, you won't just hear about the dangers lurking in the woods or the whispers of superstition. You'll feel the chill of the night, the weight of fear, and the quiet bravery of those who stood guard while others slept. So settle in, let the sounds of the night surround you, and join me as we step into the long night watch, a time where safety was fragile and every moment counted. This is more than history. It's a journey into the heart of human resilience in the face of the unknown. Stay with me, because once the night begins, there's no turning back. Dawn in the manor fields, a morning in the life of a peasant farmer. The first gray light of dawn slips quietly through the thin cracks in the wooden shutters, barely stirring the heavy shadows that fill the small hut. The air is thick with dampness, clinging to the rough wooden beams overhead, and seeping into the coarse wool blankets that barely keep the chill at bay. Outside, the fields lie cloaked in a fragile mist, the soil still cold from the night's breath, untouched, except for the faint tracks of a stray animal, or the scattered shapes of early birds stirring in the underbrush. Inside, the hut feels small and tight, made from wattle and daub, a patchwork of mud, sticks, and straw. But to the peasant farmer it is home, or at least as much home as one might claim in a world where every day is measured by survival. The floor is hard earth, trodden flat from years of footsteps, and in one corner a heap of rough straw serves as a mattress. It is barely more than a nest, flattened and coarse, without sheets or pillows to soften its unforgiving surface. The peasant stirs beneath a threadbare woolen blanket, muscles aching from the day before, back stiff from the cold night spent sleeping on straw and dirt. The faint sound of a bell echoes over the quiet countryside, the manor bell, tolling from the Lord's keep atop the hill. It is a slow, deliberate ringing, a summons that will mark the start of the day's labor. The bell carries a weight of obligation. Time to rise, time to work, time to surrender oneself once again to the demands of the land and the Lord who owns it. Time itself is a concept shaped by nature and necessity. There are no clocks here, no intricate devices marking the passing hours. Instead, the rhythms of life are dictated by the sun's slow arc across the sky and the daily toll of the bell. Dawn is a command, dusk a reluctant permission to rest. The peasant farmer's day begins in darkness, long before the sun rises fully, with the cold bite of morning air that settles deep into the bones. The rough wooden door creaks open against its rusted hinges, and a chill wind slips inside, ruffling the scant smoke lingering from last night's hearth fire. Outside, the earth is cold and hard beneath bare feet as the peasant steps into the dawn, pulling a threadbare cloak tight against the morning damp. The sky is pale, washed in muted grays and blues, the faint blush of first light hinting at the slow arrival of day. Breath clouds in the cold air as the peasant moves toward the stable, where the family's meager animals await. The small flock of chickens clucks restlessly in the straw, their feathers damp with dew. A single scrawny goat bleats softly, waiting for morning feed. The animals are lifelines in this world, food, warmth, and sometimes barter. They are fragile treasures, just as vulnerable to the harsh seasons as the people who tend them. The peasant begins the day's work with a practiced rhythm, gathering eggs, filling the goat's trough, feeding the chickens cracked grains salvaged from last season's harvest. Each task is small, but essential. In feudal France, survival is a collection of these countless small acts, repeated day after day, under the unyielding demands of the manor. As the sun creeps higher, the fields beckon, stretches of tilled earth where the peasant's family must coax life from the stubborn soil. The land is split into strips, worked not for personal gain, but as a duty to the lord of the manor. A heavy portion of every harvest is owed in taxes, leaving barely enough for the peasant family's own table. Failure to meet these demands risks punishment, and the constant worry of famine shadows every season. With rough hands, the peasant takes up the wooden hoe, its handle worn smooth from years of use. The tool feels heavy in the chill morning air, but it is the instrument of survival. Each movement is deliberate, breaking clods of earth, pulling stubborn weeds, turning the soil so that the precious seeds might take root. The land demands labor, relentless and unforgiving, its fruits never guaranteed. All around, the manor's domain wakes to life. Other peasants rise from their huts, their faces set in lines of fatigue and determination. The Lord's men patrol the boundaries, watchful eyes ensuring no one strays beyond their allotted fields. The distant church bell joins the morning chorus, calling the faithful to prayer, reminding all that even amidst hardship, the divine watches and judges. The peasant farmer's stomach growls faintly, but there is no time for breakfast yet. Morning chores stretch on until the sun is fully risen, warming the earth and chasing away the lingering damp. Meals are simple, often no more than coarse bread dipped in thin broth or watered-down ale. Meat is a rare luxury, a distant memory for many. Hunger is a constant companion, quiet but persistent. In this world, every moment is measured by need and necessity, from the rising sun to the falling darkness, from the toll of the bell to the exhaustion of the body. The life of a peasant farmer in feudal France is a cycle of work, endurance, and submission to forces larger than oneself. The comforts we take for granted, warm beds, plentiful food, moments of rest, are luxuries few here will ever know. And so the morning passes, slow and steady, the peasant moving through the fields with a quiet purpose. The soil underfoot, the chill in the air, the steady ringing of the Lord's bell, all reminders that time is owned by another, and that survival depends on meeting the demands of the manor, no matter the cost. As the day unfolds, it becomes clear why you would not last long in this place. The cold, the hunger, the relentless toil, all test the body and spirit in ways few today can imagine. The peasant farmer's world is one of hardship and resilience, where every dawn is a challenge and every sunset a hard-won reprieve. Breaking fast on gruel and hard bread, medieval meals of the common folk. As dawn unfolds over the fields and the first laborers rise to meet the day, the modest kitchens of the peasants begin their quiet rituals. Unlike the clatter and chatter that fill the great halls of castles or manor houses, the peasant's morning meal is a muted affair. Simple, humble, and often harsh in both taste and texture. The heart of this breakfast is gruel, a thin, porridge-like concoction made from whatever grains can be found, usually barley, oats, or rye, depending on the region and season. These grains are often ground coarsely between stone mills or pounded roughly, resulting in a meal that is far from the smooth, creamy oatmeal we recognize today. The preparation is modest, grains soaked and boiled in water, or when available in weak broth or thin ale, until the mixture thickens enough to provide some warmth and sustenance. The cooking takes place over a small hearth, where a cast iron pot or a thick clay bowl is set above the flickering flames. The smoky scent of burning wood mingles with the faint earthiness of the grains, creating a scent that is simple and unpretentious, a smell tied directly to survival. The gruel itself, once ladled into a bowl, is pale, watery, and often lumpy, with a texture that can be difficult to swallow without careful, slow sipping. Alongside this watery porridge rests the staple bread, dense and heavy, baked from rye or barley flour rather than wheat, which was reserved for the wealthier classes. This bread is often baked infrequently, sometimes only once a week, meaning it quickly turns hard and stale. The crust is thick and rough, cracked and darkened by the fire, while the interior is chewy and coarse. To the modern palate, it might feel like chewing on a dry rock, but for the medieval peasant, it was a vital source of calories and comfort. This bread is torn by hand, the fingers calloused and rough from toil, careful not to waste a single crumb. Occasionally, the crust might be dipped in the gruel to soften it, but even this small indulgence does little to disguise the blandness of the meal. Salt, a precious and costly commodity, might be sprinkled sparingly, or herbs like wild garlic or nettles might be added when available, but these touches are rare and fleeting. On very fortunate mornings, a small piece of salted pork or a hunk of preserved fish might be passed around the family. Salted meats were a luxury, heavily taxed and difficult to acquire for the peasantry. When available, They brought a sharp, salty tang to the table, a burst of flavor that reminded the peasants of better times or distant markets. But these moments were rare and never guaranteed. Contrast this meager fare with the breakfasts of the nobility, and the gulf between classes becomes painfully clear. In the great halls of the manor or the stone kitchens of castles, the day might begin with hearty bowls of thick, creamy pottages enriched with fresh cream or butter, fragrant with the addition of imported spices like cinnamon, cloves, or saffron. Fine white bread, made from carefully sifted wheat flour, is soft and light, often served warm and still fragrant from the oven. Meats, roasted pheasant, venison, or pork, are plentiful and richly seasoned. Fresh fruits and nuts, honey-sweetened pastries, and jellies might accompany the meal, washed down with wine or ale brewed to a high standard. The tables groan beneath the abundance, a clear display of wealth and privilege, designed to impress guests and demonstrate the Lord's power. In contrast, the peasant's table is marked by scarcity and simplicity. Every crumb of bread, every sip of gruel, is a victory over hunger, a shield against the gnawing emptiness of a life spent in relentless labor. The kitchen is small and dark, often a single room shared by family and animals alike. Pots and utensils are few and worn, passed down through generations. Preservation is primitive. Meats are salted or smoked, vegetables are stored in root cellars, and dried herbs are saved for the cold months when fresh greens are scarce. Meals are often eaten quickly between chores or while working in the fields, leaving little time for comfort or conversation. Hunger is a constant shadow, a reminder that a poor harvest or a harsh winter could mean famine and death. The peasant breakfast is not simply about nourishment. It is a ritual of endurance. The gruel warms the stomach and eases the cold, while the hard bread provides much-needed sustenance to fuel a body that will soon toil under the Lord's watchful eyes. It is a meal born of necessity, stripped of pleasure or luxury. Outside, the sounds of the manor begin to stir. The clatter of horseshoes on stone, the shouted commands of overseers, the low murmur of workers gathering tools. Inside the hut, the peasant family moves quietly through their morning routine, aware that their time belongs not to themselves, but to the demands of the land and the will of their Lord. In this world, the food on the table is a stark reflection of one's place in the social order. It is a daily reminder that survival depends not only on hard work, but on the unyielding structure of feudal society, where the Lord's needs come first and the peasant's hunger is a problem to be managed, not a right to be fulfilled. And so, as the first meal of the day is eaten in silence and simplicity, the peasant prepares to face the long hours ahead, fueled by watery gruel, hard bread, and the faint hope that tomorrow might bring a better harvest. The burden of taxes and tithes, how lords and church drained peasants' wealth. In the shadow of the manor's looming stone walls, the life of the peasant is governed not only by toil, but by an ever-present relentless drain on everything they produce and own. From the first break of dawn until the last flicker of candlelight, the common folk are bound tightly in a web of obligations that stretch far beyond the sweat on their brows and the labor of their hands. This is the harsh reality of the medieval taxation system, where every grain harvested, every animal bred, and every coin earned must be shared, divided, and surrendered to powers far removed from the peasant's humble existence. The system was complex, layered, and unforgiving. At its core was the lord of the manor, who held dominion over the land and all who worked it. Peasants were legally tied to the manor as serfs or villains, bound not only by duty, but by law to give a substantial portion of their produce and labor. These dues were known as feudal incidents, payments in kind or service that ensured the lord's wealth and power continued to grow. One of the most significant burdens was the rent, often paid not in coin but in goods, sacks of grain, bushels of vegetables, livestock, or labor. The lord demanded a fixed share of the harvest, sometimes 1/3 or even half of what the peasant grew, leaving the family to scrape by on the remainder. This portion was taken after the seed was sown and the hard work of tending the fields completed, a bitter reminder that the fruits of their labor were not their own. Alongside rent was the corvée, unpaid labor that the peasant owed to the lord's estate. This could mean days spent repairing roads, maintaining the manor's fences, working the Lord's demesne fields, or constructing fortifications. This compulsory service interrupted the peasants' own work, reducing the time available to tend their land and provide for their families. Then came the tithes, a tax of 1/10 of the peasant's produce or income, owed not to the Lord but to the church. The tithe was a spiritual obligation enforced with earthly power. It supported the local parish, paid for the upkeep of the church building, clergy salaries, and the vast monastic estates that wielded immense influence. Even in the harshest years, when the harvest was meager and hunger pressed close, the tithe had to be paid. The church, alongside the Lord, held firm to these claims, wielding both the threat of divine wrath and earthly punishment. To compound matters further, the peasant was also subject to royal taxes and levies imposed by the crown. These could take the form of occasional extraordinary payments, scutage for knights' ransoms or crusades, or direct levies to fund the king's wars. While less frequent than the Lord's demands or the tithe, royal taxes could be devastating, especially when combined with the daily tolls of feudal dues. In villages across France, tax collectors and church officials were feared visitors. They moved with stern faces and official seals, inspecting grain stores, counting livestock, and tallying goods. To avoid their eyes was impossible. Refusal or evasion was met with harsh penalties, fines, confiscation of property, or imprisonment. Worse still was the threat of excommunication from the church, a spiritual death sentence in a deeply religious society. This burden of taxation left the peasant's household perpetually vulnerable. What little grain was stored to survive the winter was at risk of being seized. Animals kept for milk, labor, or breeding might be counted and taken. Even tools and household items could be claimed if debts accrued. Families were caught in a cycle of debt, borrowing to pay taxes, only to fall deeper into obligation. The weight of these demands was not only economic, but psychological. The peasant lived with the constant fear of losing everything to the ever-watchful eyes of lords and clerics. The land that fed them was never truly theirs, tied by invisible chains to a system designed to extract maximum wealth from those least able to give it. Despite this, peasants persisted. They found ways to conceal goods, barter discreetly, and rely on community support to survive lean years. Local customs sometimes moderated the harshness of dues, and occasional manorial courts allowed disputes to be aired, but these were minor reprieves in an otherwise relentless system. The tax burden shaped every aspect of daily life, from the meager breakfast of gruel and hard bread to the scant firewood for winter, from the time available to tend children to the chances of improving one's lot. The peasant's world was one of scarcity, shaped and controlled by forces beyond their reach. And so, the harvest, the animals, and even the pennies earned from spinning wool or selling eggs were not the fruits of freedom, but the spoils of servitude. The manor lord, the church, and the king each claimed their share, leaving the peasant to survive on what remained, barely enough to live, never enough to prosper. In this way, the burden of taxes and tithes in feudal France ensured that the cycle of poverty was maintained, that power stayed concentrated, and that peasants remained firmly at the bottom of the social ladder, enduring, surviving, but rarely thriving. Rain, leaks, and the thatched roof fighting the elements in a muddy hut. The dawn's promise of light offers little comfort when the sky is heavy and gray, and the steady patter of rain becomes an unyielding rhythm outside the fragile walls of a peasant's hut. Within, the world is damp, cold, and suffused with the stubborn smell of wet earth and rotting straw. This is the reality of medieval rural life, where shelter was often as precarious as the harvest, and the seasons held dominion over every aspect of existence. The typical peasant home was a small, one-room structure built from the materials closest at hand, wattle and daub walls made by weaving branches and sticks together and plastering them with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung. These walls, though ingeniously crafted, were far from watertight or warm. Cracks and holes were common, letting in gusts of chilly wind, swarms of biting insects, and the persistent drip of rain. Above, the thatched roof stood as both protector and potential betrayer. Made from bundles of straw, reeds, or rushes carefully layered and tied to a wooden frame, the roof was the first line of defense against the elements. When dry and properly maintained, it could keep out rain and snow for a season or two. But thatch was a living material. It rotted, shifted, and thinned with each passing year, becoming brittle under the harshness of sun, wind, and winter's ice. During heavy rains or prolonged storms, the roof often failed. Water seeped through the layers, dripping steadily into the hut below, forming dark stains on the earthen floor and splattering on the few belongings within. The occupants could hear the distinct, relentless sound of rain striking the thatch above, a constant reminder of nature's power over human effort. Inside, the damp was everywhere. The bed, little more than a rough pallet of straw or hay stuffed into a wooden frame, absorbed moisture. The bedding became sodden and cold, forcing the family to wake shivering, their clothes sticking to their skin. Blankets were rare and precious. The chill penetrated deeply, inviting illness and exhaustion. The earthen floor, packed down over years of footsteps, was uneven and soft. Mud puddled in low spots, and boots and feet were perpetually coated in grime. The walls sometimes oozed moisture, and during winter, the cold seeped through with a bitter bite. The hearth fire offered some heat, but it was smoky, small, and quickly consumed the limited supply of wood or peat. Efforts to keep dry and warm were constant, but often futile. Families patched the roof with fresh bundles of straw or reeds, pressed mud into cracks, and hung strips of cloth or rushes over doorways to block drafts. Window openings were covered with oiled parchment or thin cloth instead of glass, allowing light but little warmth or protection. The smoke hole in the roof, essential to let out the cooking fire's fumes, was a double-edged sword. It let the smoke escape but also allowed rain and snow to fall inside. When the wind shifted, damp and cold air rushed in, mingling with the soot and ash, adding to the misery. During the worst storms, the family might huddle together on the driest patch of the floor, trying to shield the youngest and weakest from the cold. The sound of rain dripping into buckets or pots placed beneath leaks was a small comfort, a way to prevent water from pooling on the floor. Yet, the smell of wet straw and mildew was inescapable, permeating clothing, hair, and skin. The humble possessions of a peasant family were few but vital: a wooden chest for storing grains or tools, simple pottery for cooking and eating, a few scraps of clothing woven from coarse wool or flax. All these could be damaged or ruined by dampness, forcing difficult choices between repairing, replacing, or going without. Outside, the muddy paths leading to the fields became rivers of slick earth, turning every journey into a treacherous endeavor. Animals, too, suffered. Their shelters were no better than those of their owners, and muddy pens made tending them a miserable task. Despite these hardships, village communities banded together to share knowledge and labor. Thatched roofs might be repaired communally during village gatherings, and neighbors helped each other shore up weak walls or clear drainage ditches to divert water. These acts of cooperation were essential survival strategies, a fragile shield against a hostile environment. Yet, even with all care, the weather was a formidable foe. Spring rains could flood fields and homes alike. Summers brought drought and dust. Autumns drenched the earth in cold fog, and winters sealed the village in ice and snow. The hut was a fragile refuge, a place where comfort was rare, and the struggle against nature never ceased. To live in a thatched roof hut was to live with constant uncertainty. Uncertainty about the next storm, the next leak, the next cold night. It was a life of endurance, shaped by the rhythms of the weather and the limits of human craft. The elements were both enemy and companion, forging a deep connection between people and the land, but also a persistent reminder of their vulnerability. And so, as the rain seeps through the thatch and pools on the floor, as the chill penetrates the walls and the night deepens outside, the peasant family waits for dawn, hoping for sun, for warmth, for a break in the endless battle with rain, leaks, and the humble, thatched roof. The village church and its unyielding grip, religion's power in feudal society. In the heart of every medieval village, often perched on a slight rise or central crossroads, stood the church, a stone or timber estuary that was both a beacon of faith and a pillar of power. Its simple bell tolled through fields and forests, marking time, summoning the faithful, and reminding every peasant of the ever-watchful eyes of both God and man. The church was far more than a place of worship. It was the very foundation of village life, entwined with the social, economic, and political threads that shaped feudal society. For the peasant, the church was a place of hope and fear, comfort and control. It was here that births were blessed, marriages sanctified, and deaths mourned. The rhythm of the year was punctuated by holy days and saints' festivals, moments when the village gathered in joy or solemnity. Yet beneath these moments of communal unity lay a profound and unyielding grip. The church's authority extended into nearly every corner of daily existence. At the center of this authority was the tithe, the church's claim to 1/10 of every peasant's produce or income. It was a constant drain on already meager resources, a tax that fed the clergy, maintained the building, and enriched monastic estates that sprawled across the countryside. Even in years of poor harvest or hardship, the tithe was demanded without mercy. Failure to pay risked not only material punishment, but spiritual condemnation, the fearsome prospect of excommunication, being cast out from the community and barred from the sacraments that promised salvation. The local priest was the embodiment of this dual role, spiritual shepherd and economic enforcer. Often drawn from humble origins but educated in Latin, theology, and canon law, the priest wielded immense influence. His word could comfort a grieving widow or condemn a sinner. His presence could inspire faith or suppress dissent. Parishioners turned to him for guidance, confession, and absolution, yet he also collected the tithes and oversaw the church's lands and income. Church services shaped the peasant's week. Sundays and holy days mandated rest from labor, yet the hours spent kneeling, chanting, and listening to Latin prayers could feel long and exhausting. The Mass was a mysterious ritual, largely incomprehensible to those who did not speak Latin, reinforcing a sense of awe and distance. Saints' days offered breaks from toil, but also imposed additional obligations, processions, almsgiving, and attendance at church fairs. Beyond tithes, the church wielded other economic powers. It owned vast tracts of land, worked by serfs or leased to peasants, generating wealth that rivaled the nobility. Monasteries served as centers of learning, charity, and administration, but also as landlords who demanded rent and labor. The church's courts could adjudicate disputes, enforce moral conduct, and impose penalties, blending religious and civil authority. Religion permeated the peasant's worldview, shaping fears and hopes alike. The ever-present threat of sin, judgment, and damnation influenced behavior, community norms, and even local laws. Confession was both a personal ritual and a social control, ensuring conformity and obedience. Miracles, visions, and saints' relics inspired devotion, but also reinforced the church's spiritual monopoly. For many peasants, the church was a paradox, a source of solace amid hardship, yet a powerful institution that sustained inequality and control. Its stones and stained glass, its prayers and penances, its festivals and funerals all wove a complex tapestry that bound the village to the rhythms of faith and feudal obligation. In this way, the village church stood not just as a house of God, but as a fortress of power, shaping lives through the intertwining of the sacred and the secular. To live in feudal France was to live under its watchful gaze, a gaze that promised eternal salvation but demanded earthly submission. Life with lice and dirt, hygiene in a medieval village. In the dim, cramped interiors of a medieval peasant's home, life was shaped as much by what was invisible as what was seen. Dust settled thick on wooden beams, straw and bedding lay crushed and soiled, and the very air carried the scent of unwashed bodies and animals. Hygiene as we understand it today was a foreign concept, and the people who lived in these conditions knew only a slow, grinding existence alongside lice, fleas, and the ever-present grime of daily labor. Peasants rarely bathed, partly because of limited access to clean water and partly because of the prevailing beliefs about health. Bathing was often associated with vanity or sin, and the dangers of cold water in a world without reliable heating meant a quick wash was considered a risky indulgence. Instead, most washed their faces and hands only occasionally, using a cloth or handful of cold water from the well. Soap, when it was available, was crude and expensive, often made from animal fat mixed with ash and used sparingly. Clothing, usually made of coarse wool or rough linen, was worn until it was threadbare and infested with tiny pests. Lice were a constant companion. These small insects thrived in the folds of fabric and entangled hair, biting and causing relentless itching. Fleas were just as common, jumping from dirty floors, or the fur of animals who shared the living space. Both carried disease, discomfort, and embarrassment, but they were accepted as part of life. The cramped space of the peasant hut, often housing entire families and sometimes their animals, made cleanliness almost impossible. Animals, chickens, pigs, and sometimes a cow or goat, lived indoors during cold or wet weather, their manure and body heat adding to the muddied floors and pungent odors. Floors were swept only rarely, and the straw mattress was often changed just once a year or less. The dampness that seeped through the walls and the thatched roof created a breeding ground for mold and bacteria, contributing to respiratory illnesses and skin infections. Cuts and scratches, common from daily farm labor, were slow to heal and easily infected. Without proper medical knowledge or access to doctors, peasants relied on herbal remedies, superstitions, and prayers to alleviate suffering. Illnesses spread quickly in such conditions. Parasites brought fevers, rashes, and sores, weakening the body and increasing vulnerability to more serious diseases like dysentery or plague. The church sometimes provided rudimentary care, and monasteries served as centers for healing and herbal medicine, but for most peasants, sickness meant isolation and despair. Despite these hardships, peasants developed coping mechanisms. Combing hair daily with wooden or bone combs helped reduce lice, though it could not eliminate them. Burning herbs like rosemary or lavender in the hearth masked odors and was believed to purify the air. Families used rough cloths to rub down skin and tried to keep sleeping areas as clean as possible given their means. Social customs also played a role. Peasants valued community hygiene rituals, such as washing hands before meals or after certain tasks, and village gatherings sometimes included communal washing in streams or rivers where the water was freshest. Yet privacy was scarce, and modesty was often sacrificed to necessity. The stark reality was that the medieval peasant's life was one of continual negotiation with dirt, insects, and disease. It was a life where hygiene was less about cleanliness and more about survival, accepting discomfort and filth as inevitable companions in a harsh, unforgiving world. To live in a feudal village was to be intimately acquainted with the limits of the human body and spirit. The relentless presence of lice and dirt was a daily test of endurance, shaping not only health, but also social relations and personal dignity. It was a world where every scratch itched, every bite burned, and every unwashed day was a battle against decay and despair. The long walk to market, journeys for trade and survival. Before dawn breaks, the peasant rises once more, stiff and weary from the day before, burdened by the knowledge that the long walk to market waits ahead. The path to the nearest town is a ribbon of dirt and stones winding through fields, hedgerows, and tangled forests, stretching miles beyond the humble hamlet. It is a journey not only of distance but of endurance, fraught with the weight of hope and hardship intertwined. The goods to be sold or traded are modest: a basket of eggs, a few vegetables hastily gathered, a handful of woven cloth, or a small jar of honey. Each item represents countless hours of toil, planting, tending, harvesting, weaving, distilled into fragile hopes for a few coins or a valuable trade. The peasant shoulders these goods carefully, balancing them on the back or in worn baskets, mindful of every step and the precious weight they carry. The road itself is a challenge. Uneven and muddy after rain, dusty and hot under the sun, it offers no comfort or shelter. The peasant walks beside carts rattling along, passed by riders on horseback whose lives seem far removed from this slow pilgrimage. Wild animals lurk in the shadows of the woods, and highwaymen sometimes lie in wait, though in the busiest seasons, the market throngs offer some safety in numbers. Along the way, the peasant's thoughts drift. To the family left behind, to the livestock that must be fed, to the uncertainty of whether the day's trade will yield enough to buy salt, candles, or a bit of extra grain. The market is not simply a place of commerce. It is a lifeline, a chance to barter goods, exchange news, and maintain a connection to a world beyond the manor's fields. Arriving at the market, the peasant is met with the chaos of stalls, shouting vendors, and the mingled smells of fresh bread, livestock, and smoke from cooking fires. It is a cacophony of color and sound: farmers hawking vegetables, craftsmen displaying wares, nobles browsing fine cloth and imported spices. The peasant moves cautiously, bargaining for fair prices, wary of cheats, and always mindful of the coin's value. Yet success is never guaranteed. A bad harvest might mean goods are scarce and costly, or that buyers are too poor to pay. Some days the peasant returns home with less than hoped, the weight of empty baskets heavier than before. The journey back is slow, the evening growing cold and dark, with exhaustion creeping into aching muscles. This arduous trek to market was a vital thread in the fabric of feudal life. It linked isolated villages to the wider world, sustaining families and the local economy. But it demanded physical strength, resilience, and patience, qualities required every day in a life marked by toil and uncertainty. To endure this journey was to confront the fragile balance between survival and scarcity, hope and disappointment, a testament to the peasant's stubborn determination in a world that offered little mercy. The miller's secret: how grain was controlled and crooked deals made. In the heart of the village, beside the bubbling stream or the river's edge, stood the mill, a simple wooden structure crowned with sails or a water wheel, its constant turning the rhythm of rural life. To the peasant, the mill was a gatekeeper, the final and most crucial step between harvest and the bread on the table. Yet behind its doors lay secrets, shadows of control and exploitation that few dared speak of openly. The miller was more than a mere craftsman. He was a figure of power and suspicion. Entrusted with the task of grinding the Lord's grain and that of the peasants, the miller's role was vital. Without his labor, wheat could not become flour, and flour could not become bread. But this entrusted power came with temptation. The miller controlled access to the village's staple food, and in a world where bread was life itself, this control was a subtle but formidable form of authority. Most peasants paid a toll in grain, known as the multure, a fraction of their harvest taken as a fee for grinding. This levy, sometimes a tenth or more, was a crushing burden on already thin resources. But beyond the official toll, rumors whispered of millers who enriched themselves through cunning tricks and crooked measures. Some were accused of stealing grain outright, others of secretly taking extra portions during grinding, their scales tipped and their measures skewed. The grinding process itself was a mystery to many villagers. The heavy stones, turning steadily by water or wind, seemed to hide the miller's manipulations. Peasants could not easily verify how much grain was lost in the process or how much flour they truly received. Complaints were dangerous. Accusing the miller risked reprisals, for he was often under the protection of the Lord, a middleman between the peasantry and the manorial hierarchy. Stories abounded of millers who stored grain for themselves, delaying grinding until they could sell flour at a higher price, or who mixed lower quality grain with the Lord's best to maximize profits. This control over the vital resource sowed resentment and suspicion throughout the village. The miller was at once necessary and reviled, a gatekeeper of survival, yet a symbol of exploitation. Yet the miller's position was precarious as well. He had to maintain the water wheel and the grinding stones, negotiate with the Lord for his rights and protections, and manage the ever-changing flow of grain through his mill. His livelihood depended on a delicate balance, extracting enough profit without pushing the villagers to rebellion or leaving the mill idle. This delicate equilibrium reflects the wider realities of feudal life, where power and survival were entwined in layers of obligation and control. The miller's secret was just one piece in a complex web of exploitation, where every step from field to table was marked by tolls, theft, and the struggle to keep what little was earned. To live under the miller's shadow was to know the bitter truth that even the bread you baked was not truly yours, but passed through the hands of those who held power over the means of life. It was a slow lesson in mistrust, cunning, and the harsh economics of feudal survival, a world where you had to watch every grain or lose everything. The manor court and the bailiff, justice and punishment in feudal France. In the heart of every manor, beneath the lord's imposing residence, lay the manor court, a place where justice was dispensed with swift, often ruthless authority. This court was not a symbol of fairness or due process, but a mechanism of control, designed to maintain the fragile order of feudal life and uphold the privileges of the lord. For peasants, it was a place of fear and uncertainty, where even the smallest misstep could lead to harsh punishment. The bailiff, the lord's appointed enforcer and magistrate, presided over the manor court with an air of stern impartiality, though his judgments were often anything but fair. He was a figure both respected and dreaded, a man who carried the power to levy fines, order physical punishments, and imprison those who defied the manor's rules. His authority extended over every tenant on the land, from the poorest serf to the wealthier villain, binding them all under the lord's jurisdiction. Justice in the manor court was arbitrary by modern standards. There were no juries or defense attorneys, no appeals or written laws to protect the accused. The bailiff's word was law, and evidence was often little more than hearsay or accusation. Peasants were frequently summoned for infractions that to an outsider might seem trivial, failing to repair a fence, neglecting to deliver labor days, or letting livestock stray onto the Lord's fields. These minor breaches were met with fines or corporal punishments designed to reinforce obedience. Punishments were varied and could be brutal. Fines often took the form of money the peasant could scarcely afford, forcing further hardship. Physical punishments, whipping, stocks, or the infamous pillory, were public spectacles meant to shame and deter. Imprisonment, though less common, was a grim fate, as manor jails were dark, damp, and unhealthy, offering no hope of comfort or mercy. For peasants, the manor court was a place of dread, not only because of the punishments, but because of the unpredictability. A neighbor's word might be enough to condemn, and personal vendettas could be settled under the guise of law. The bailiff's presence in the village was a constant reminder of the Lord's power, a watchful eye ensuring that the fragile hierarchy remained unchallenged. Yet the manor court was also a place where social order was maintained, disputes settled, and obligations enforced. In a world without centralized state justice, this local system provided a crude but necessary mechanism for managing land, labor, and relationships. It was the law as the peasants knew it, harsh, unforgiving, and deeply tied to their survival. To live under the bailiff's gaze was to accept a life where justice was neither blind nor balanced, but a tool wielded by those in power. The court's relentless demands, its swift punishments, and its lack of mercy were daily reminders that in feudal France, the rule of law was less about fairness and more about control. It was a system built to keep peasants in their place, enforcing a social order that left little room for mercy or escape. In this place of judgment, survival depended on obedience, vigilance, and the constant awareness that the next summons to court could change everything. The manor court was a crucible of power and fear, shaping the lives of peasants with every harsh sentence, every fine collected, and every punishment meted out, an unforgiving reminder that in feudal society, justice was a privilege of the few, not a right for all. Saints, superstition, and pilgrimage, faith beyond the church walls. In the patchwork fields and humble huts of feudal France, faith stretched far beyond the stone walls of the village church. For peasants, belief was not confined to the sermons of priests or the rigid doctrines of the clergy. Instead, it was woven deeply into the fabric of daily life, a blend of saints, superstitions, relics, and rituals that shaped their understanding of the world and their fragile place within it. The church was a powerful institution, certainly, but the spiritual landscape of the common folk was far more complex. Peasants carried small tokens, wooden crosses, charms, or scraps of cloth said to be touched by saints, close to their bodies, believing in their protective powers against illness, misfortune, and evil spirits. These relics, often blessed during local feast days or brought back from distant shrines, were tangible links to the divine, a source of hope in a harsh world. Pilgrimage was another vital part of this lived faith. Though arduous and sometimes perilous, journeys to holy sites were undertaken with devotion and desperation alike. Whether traveling to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, the Shrine of St. James, or local sanctuaries dedicated to lesser-known saints, peasants sought healing, forgiveness, or miracles. The pilgrimage was a physical and spiritual trial, a test of faith and endurance that could bring temporary relief from the endless toil of daily life. Yet alongside these devotions thrived a world of superstition and fear. Peasants lived in constant awareness of invisible forces, curses whispered by neighbors, witches lurking in the shadows, or divine wrath waiting to be unleashed for sins both real and imagined. Misfortunes such as crop failure, illness, or sudden death were often attributed not to natural causes, but to the malevolent actions of witches or the displeasure of saints angered by neglected prayers or broken vows. The fear of witchcraft was especially potent. Accusations could arise from jealousy, suspicion, or inexplicable events, creating a climate of mistrust and paranoia within villages. Remedies ranged from herbal concoctions to prayers, and exorcisms performed by clergy sought to purge evil influences. Yet these fears were intertwined with faith, as the line between holy protection and supernatural menace was thin and uncertain. Prayers themselves were deeply personal and pragmatic. Before dawn, peasants might whisper thanks for a dry night or a good harvest. At dusk, they might beseech saints for safety through the coming dark. The rhythm of the day was marked by such rituals, signs of the cross traced hastily, murmured invocations to patron saints, and offerings left at shrines or under ancient trees believed to harbor spirits. These practices were not mere superstition, but essential survival strategies. In a world where the caprices of weather, disease, and fortune could spell ruin, faith was a way to impose meaning and order on chaos. It offered a fragile comfort, a way to cope with suffering and uncertainty when human power was limited and life was precarious. The intertwining of saintly devotion and superstition reveals a peasant worldview where the sacred and the everyday coexisted uneasily. It was a faith born from necessity, shaped by hardship, and expressed through acts both solemn and fearful. It was a belief system that demanded vigilance, humility, and sometimes fear, a reminder that in feudal France, spiritual survival was as demanding as physical endurance. For the peasant, the world was alive with forces seen and unseen, where saints could intervene to save a life, witches might curse a field, and pilgrimage could offer a glimmer of hope. It was a world where faith extended beyond church walls into the very soil beneath their feet, the whispering woods, and the skies above, a constant companion in a life marked by toil, uncertainty, and the search for grace. Feasts you won't attend, the contrast of noble banquets and peasant tables. In the grand halls of feudal France's nobility, life unfolded in a world far removed from the daily grind of the peasant fields and mud-walled huts. These great feasts were spectacles of wealth, power, and excess, vivid contrasts to the humble, often meager meals that sustained the common folk. For peasants, such feasts were not experiences to be shared, but distant echoes heard in whispered tales and fleeting smells carried by the wind. Imagine entering a lord's great hall during a feast. The room is alive with flickering torchlight and the gleam of polished wooden tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, freshly baked breads, and delicate pastries. The air is thick with the mingling aromas of spiced wine, sizzling boar, and sweetened fruits preserved in honey. Servants glide silently, bearing gilded platters piled high with delicacies. Musicians play lutes and flutes, their melodies weaving through the chatter and laughter of nobles adorned in rich velvets and furs. At the center of the feast, a whole roasted boar, its skin crisped to a golden sheen, commands attention, presented with fanfare and accompanied by sauces steeped in herbs and wine. Pies stuffed with game and poultry, fresh fish caught from nearby rivers, and an array of cheeses and fruits add to the banquet's grandeur. Goblets of ruby red wine, thick and fragrant, are raised in toasts to health, loyalty, and prosperity. In this environment, food is a symbol of status and celebration, a sensory indulgence enjoyed slowly, with ceremony and plenty. The feast is not merely about nourishment. It is a performance of power, a reinforcement of social hierarchy, and a rare respite from the politics and violence that shape noble life. For peasants, by contrast, the daily table was sparse and utilitarian. The staples were coarse rye or barley bread, often hard and stale by the time it reached their hands, and watery gruel, a porridge of oats or legumes that filled the belly but left much to be desired in taste and texture. Meat was a luxury seldom afforded. A peasant might hope for salted pork or occasional scraps from the lord's kitchen, but more often subsisted on vegetables, beans, and the occasional egg. The humble peasant meal was eaten quickly and without ceremony, often standing or huddled by a meager fire in a dimly lit hut. The flavors were plain, the portions small, and the tools crude, wooden bowls and spoons worn smooth by years of use. Salt, a precious commodity, was sparingly applied, Spices, rare and costly, were virtually unknown to the common table. The sounds of a peasant meal are quiet, marked by the scraping of wooden spoons against bowls, the crackle of embers in the hearth, and the occasional murmur of conversation. There is no music, no laughter born of ease, only the subdued rhythms of survival and the quiet gratitude for food enough to last until the next day. The sensory gulf between noble feasts and peasant fare was not merely a matter of ingredients, but a reflection of the broader social order. While the lord's table displayed abundance and luxury, the peasant's table bore the marks of scarcity and endurance. This contrast reinforced the rigid hierarchies of feudal life, reminding peasants daily of their place and the privileges they lacked. Yet, even within this stark divide, moments of communal sharing and celebration punctuated peasant life. Seasonal festivals, harvest celebrations, or church feast days brought opportunities for special foods, a richer stew, fresh milk, or the rare treat of honeyed cakes. These occasions, though modest, were treasured breaks from routine hardship, moments when the community gathered to share food, song, and stories. Still, the peasants knew that the sumptuous feasts of the nobility were not meant for them. The roasted boar, the sweet wines, the exotic spices, these were luxuries to be admired from afar, symbols of a world locked behind heavy gates and guarded by knights. The smells wafting from the manor's kitchens teased their senses, a reminder of the abundance they would never claim. To endure in feudal France was to accept this divide, to nourish oneself on the simplest of fare while the lords feasted in grandeur. It was a lesson in humility and restraint, a daily negotiation with hunger and desire. The banquet halls echoed with joy and plenty, while the peasant's hearth flickered with quiet survival. In this contrast lies a powerful truth about feudal life. It was a world shaped not only by power and land, but by food and its unequal distribution. The noble feast was a spectacle of dominance, a ritual of privilege. The peasant's table was a testament to resilience, a daily act of making do with little. And between these worlds, the scent of roasted boar and the taste of hard bread marked the enduring gulf that no peasant could easily cross. Plowing the fields, tools and toil, the backbreaking work of farming. The first light of dawn barely touches the horizon when the peasant farmer rises once more to meet the relentless demands of the fields. The world outside his hut is still shrouded in a cool gray mist, the air sharp with the scent of damp earth and morning dew. Today, like every day, begins with the arduous task of plowing, an exhausting ritual that binds man, animal, and land in a ceaseless cycle of toil. The plow itself is a simple, unforgiving instrument. Forged mostly from wood, with a single iron blade sharpened to cut through the stubborn soil, it is crude but indispensable. Unlike modern machines that slice effortlessly through fields, this wooden plow requires every ounce of strength and skill to guide it straight and true. The furrows must be deep enough to break the earth, but careful not to waste precious soil or risk damaging roots below. The farmer's hands, cracked and calloused from years of labor, grip the worn handles. His fingernails are permanently stained with dirt, a badge of honor and hardship alike. His back aches even before the plowing begins, a slow, familiar pain that never fully subsides. The rough linen of his shirt clings to his skin, damp from sweat and the morning chill, as he leads the oxen, large, patient beasts yoked together, their breath steaming in the cold air. The oxen, as much partners in the work as beasts of burden, trudge steadily through the heavy soil. Their hooves sink slightly with each step, leaving impressions that will soon be filled by the turned earth. With each pull, the plow's blade gouges the land, breaking clods of dirt apart, turning the dark, fertile earth over in neat, even rows. The farmer's muscles strain, his legs steady against uneven ground, his arms locked in a grip that never loosens. This labor is more than physical. It is a test of endurance, patience, and quiet resolve. Hours pass in rhythmic motion, push, pull, guide, interrupted only by the occasional lowing of the oxen or the creak of wooden harnesses. The sun climbs higher, warming the farmer's skin but also drying his lips and tightening his throat. There is no respite until the last furrow is laid, the field shaped and prepared for seed. Plowing is only the beginning of a season-long struggle. Once the earth is turned, the farmer must sow seed by hand, scattering grains that will cling precariously to soil and hope. Then come the weeding, watering, and endless vigilance against pests and harsh weather. Each step requires strength and care, for a single failed season can mean hunger and despair. In this medieval world, farming is a life tethered tightly to the land's demands and the unyielding rhythms of nature. There are no shortcuts, no machines to ease the burden, only raw human effort, worn tools, and the steady persistence of those who feed the village. The field is both a source of life and a place of suffering. The dirt under the fingernails, the splinters from wooden handles, the blisters on sunburned hands, all mark the slow, grinding work of survival. For peasants, this labor is unending, and the rewards are scant. A few sacks of grain, a small portion to carry home, and the hope that next year will bring enough to live. To last a day in this life requires more than strength. It demands an acceptance of hardship, a submission to the land's will, and the quiet courage to endure without complaint. The wooden plow scratches deep furrows in the earth, but it also etches the story of struggle, perseverance, and the timeless bond between human and soil. The harvest and the Lord's share, how your labor became his grain. The golden sun, high and unrelenting, pours down over the fields where peasants gather at harvest time, a season of exhaustion, hope, and bitter reality. After months of backbreaking work, the ripe grain sways heavy in the late summer breeze, whispering promises of sustenance and survival. Yet beneath the beauty of the waving stalks lies the harsh truth of feudal life. Almost none of this harvest truly belongs to the farmer who labored to bring it forth. The harvest is a communal affair, a hurried rush as every able body, men, women, and even children, descends upon the fields with sickles and scythes, cutting stalk after stalk with methodical precision. The air is thick with the sharp scent of freshly cut grain, dust, and sweat, punctuated by the quiet murmur of shared songs and prayers meant to bless the crop and protect the harvesters from misfortune. Bundles of wheat and barley are gathered into sheaves and transported to the threshing floor, where they will be beaten and separated from the chaff. This labor, too, is grueling and unending, but the peasants press on with a grim determination, for the grain is their lifeline. It will be ground into flour, baked into bread, the staple of their meager diet, and stored to carry them through the bitter cold of winter. But as the piles of grain grow, so too does the shadow of the manor lord's claim. The feudal system's unforgiving rules dictate that the largest share of the harvest, often half or more, must be surrendered to the lord of the manor as rent for the land the peasants work. This levy, known as the banalites, or various rents in kind, is more than a simple tribute. It is a constant reminder of the peasants' subjugation and the economic grip the Lord holds over their lives. The grain given to the Lord is stored in his granaries, protected and counted with meticulous care. From this store he will feed his household, his servants, and his retinue, sell surplus at the market for profit, and supply his knights and retainers who enforce his rule. The peasants, in contrast, receive only the scraps left over, barely enough to nourish their families through the coming months. This division is neither fair nor negotiable. The Lord's right to the harvest is backed by law, custom, and the threat of punishment. Failure to deliver the expected share can result in fines, the seizure of tools or livestock, or worse, the loss of the very land that the peasants depend on to survive. Even the church claims a portion of the harvest through the tithe, a mandatory tenth of all produce given as a sacred offering. This further reduces what remains for the peasant household, deepening the cycle of scarcity and hardship. As the harvest concludes, the peasant families retreat to their homes, exhausted and anxious, carrying with them only a fraction of the fruits of their labor. The silos and granaries of the manor stand full and secure, monuments to a system designed to enrich the few at the expense of the many. The harvest season is a paradox, a time of plenty shadowed by want. It is a reminder that the peasant's daily toil, from plowing to sowing to reaping, ultimately fuels a hierarchy that benefits the Lord and the church far more than those who sweat beneath the sun to coax life from the soil. To last a day in feudal France, one would need to reconcile with this reality, that no matter how hard you work, the harvest belongs mostly to another, and your survival depends on accepting the crumbs left behind. Shepherd life in the wolves, nights in the forest, watching the flock. As dusk settles over the rolling hills and dense forests of feudal France, the shepherd prepares for a night unlike any other, a night spent alone, guarding the precious flock against dangers that lurk unseen. The world becomes a shadowy realm where every crackle of twigs and distant howl pierces the stillness, seeping deep into the marrow of a man whose very survival depends on vigilance. Shepherding in the 13th century is no gentle pastoral idyll. It is a brutal, isolating existence, defined by long hours and harsher nights. The small group of sheep, valuable for their wool, milk, and meat, must be protected at all costs. These animals are the livelihood of the village's poorest families and a vital asset in the manorial economy. Lose a single sheep to wolves or thieves, and a family's fragile stability teeters on the brink. As darkness deepens, the shepherd wraps himself in a coarse woolen cloak, its rough fibers barely shielding him from the creeping chill. His breath billows in the cold air, mingling with the faint scent of damp earth and pine resin. The sky above is a canopy of stars, cold and distant, offering no comfort against the weight of solitude. With only a crooked staff in hand and the low bleating of sheep echoing softly, the shepherd moves slowly among the flock, eyes straining to pierce the blackness beyond. Every sound, rustling leaves, snapping branches, the whisper of wind through the pines, sets his heart racing. The forests around are home to wolves, cunning and relentless predators that have long terrorized rural communities. To see one in the distance is to know that death and destruction might follow. But the wolves are not the only threat. Bandits and thieves roam these woods too, drawn by the promise of easy prey and little resistance. A shepherd caught unprepared may be robbed of his modest belongings, or worse, attacked without mercy. The laws offer little protection in such remote places, and the nearest aid is often miles away. The shepherd's watch is one of endless patience and dread. There is no warmth beyond the flicker of a small fire hastily built to keep the cold at bay and ward off predators. Smoke curls upwards in thin streams that are barely visible in the moonlight. He must remain alert, even as exhaustion threatens to pull his eyelids closed. Throughout the night, the shepherd listens for the mournful howls of wolves echoing through the valley, a chilling reminder that nature's balance is one of constant peril. The sheep, sensing danger, huddle close, their bodies pressing against each other in quiet, nervous companionship. The shepherd's own heartbeat pounds in his ears, a rhythm of tension and determination. The forest seems alive with unseen eyes, glowing faintly perhaps in the distance, or moving swiftly through underbrush. Every crack or snap feels amplified, as if the shadows themselves might be closing in. The mind plays tricks, and every instinct screams to flee, but flight means abandoning the flock, a betrayal that could bring ruin. Dawn cannot come soon enough. The pale light of early morning, filtering through branches heavy with dew, offers relief but also a stark reminder of the night's toll. The shepherd's hands are raw and cracked, his back aching from hours bent over in vigilance. Yet the flock remains intact, safe for another day. To live as a shepherd in feudal France is to accept loneliness and danger as constant companions. It is a life shaped by cold, hunger, fear, and relentless responsibility. Few could endure such nights without breaking, without succumbing to despair or the wildness that prowls just beyond the firelight. In these moments, amid the biting cold and shadowed woods, the fragility of peasant life is laid bare. Here, survival demands not only strength, but a steadfast heart, a mind sharpened by dread, and an unwavering devotion to the flock that represents both hope and hardship in an unforgiving world. Winter's grip. Surviving cold and hunger in the village. When winter's cold fingers closed around the village, life slowed to a desperate crawl. The seasons stretched endlessly, a gray expanse of frozen earth, brittle branches and bone-deep chill that seeped through every crevice of the peasant's humble home. The harsh reality of surviving those months, when the landscape was stripped bare and food stores ran perilously low, was a daily trial of endurance, resourcefulness, and grim acceptance. The fire, the heart of the dwelling, was both a blessing and a constant burden. Every scrap of wood saved from the fields or forest was precious, carefully hoarded to stave off the creeping cold. Smoke curled lazily from the thin chimney as flames flickered against stone walls, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the cold outside. But the fire could never burn bright enough to chase away the chill that gnawed at fingers, toes, and lungs. In these frigid months, the air inside the hut was thick with the scent of damp wool, smoked meat, and stale bread, the staples that had to carry the family through the lean season. Winter food stores were meager, a handful of salted pork, some dried beans, root vegetables stored in cold earth pits, and the ever-present hard bread, which was more tool than nourishment. Fresh produce was a memory, replaced by the bitter tang of survival. Meals shrank to near whispers of sustenance. Gruel, thin and lukewarm, was the morning's fare, a watery porridge that filled stomachs but left hands trembling with hunger. The absence of fresh food and the monotony of repeated meals weighed heavily on spirits, the hunger gnawing like a silent, unyielding companion. Outside, the village was a frozen skeleton. Fields lay fallow beneath a thick blanket of snow, their promise of harvest long vanished into the cold. The animals, the flock, the pigs, the few remaining chickens, huddled in pens, their breath misting in the icy air. Caring for them was a chore fraught with risk. Stepping into the snow was a gamble with frostbite, and the relentless cold stiffened joints and slowed weary limbs. Water sources froze over, forcing villagers to trek farther to find flowing streams or melt snow for drinking. Every movement was weighed down by heavy woolen cloaks, boots crusted with ice, and fingers so numb they could barely grasp the tools needed for simple tasks. Illness spread swiftly during these months. The cold sapped strength and lowered resistance, while cramped, poorly ventilated huts became breeding grounds for coughs, fevers, and chills. The old, the young, and the frail were especially vulnerable, their bodies too weak to fight the relentless assault of winter's embrace. Yet the village's daily rhythm persisted. Firewood was gathered in small niche dangerous bursts. Chores were accomplished with slow, deliberate care to avoid exhaustion. The occasional trip to the Lord's granary was a tense affair, as rations were minimal and charity rare. Bartering and sharing within the community softened the blow, but could not erase the ever-present specter of hunger. The long nights were filled with whispered prayers and tales of better times, voices low and hopeful in the flickering firelight. Candle flames sputtered as families huddled close, seeking warmth in each other's presence against the howling wind outside. Surviving winter in feudal France was a test of human will, an endurance of cold, hunger, and isolation that could break the strongest of spirits. To last even a single day in such conditions required more than strength. It demanded resilience born of generations, a quiet acceptance of hardship, and the faint, flickering hope that spring would come again. The Black Death shadows, early signs and village fears. In the quiet rhythm of village life, an invisible shadow began to creep, first whispered in frightened murmurs, then shouted in urgent warnings. The Black Death, a plague unlike any before, slipped silently across the lands, an unseen enemy that would shatter the fragile existence of feudal France. For peasants living day to day, its early signs were subtle yet terrifying. Unexplained fevers, swollen lumps in the groin or armpits, the sudden death of neighbors and kin, and a creeping dread that clung tighter than the coldest winter's breath. The village, already burdened by toil and hardship, soon became a place of whispered panic and desperate hope. Tales spread quickly. Some said it was God's punishment for sins, others blamed witches or foreigners. No one understood how it traveled, only that it was unstoppable, a swift and cruel visitor that spared neither child nor elder. Doors were barred, fires burned endlessly in hearths and streets, and prayers to saints filled the damp air, mingling with the scent of burning herbs, thought to ward off evil. Yet fear was not the only response. The plague's arrival brought confusion and superstition into sharp focus. Some villagers turned to faith with renewed fervor, seeking absolution and protection in rituals and pilgrimages. Others, gripped by terror, sought scapegoats, often accusing outsiders or marginalized members of the community of bringing the curse. The fragile social fabric began to fray under suspicion and grief. Illness struck quickly, often with little warning. The first signs, chills, headaches, vomiting, were followed by the appearance of buboes, swollen, painful swellings that marked the disease's cruel progress. As these blackened lumps spread, so did the terror. Those afflicted were shunned or hidden away in makeshift isolation huts. though the cramped and unsanitary conditions only helped the plague spread faster. Families watched helplessly as loved ones withered away, their bodies wasting in days, their spirits slipping quietly into the unknown. The village church, once a place of comfort, became overwhelmed with sorrow. Priests, fearing contagion, sometimes fled or refused last rites, leaving many to face death alone. Burials were hurried and simple. Mass graves replaced sacred tombs, and the usual rituals of mourning became impossible under the weight of loss. The boundaries between life and death blurred, and superstition filled the void. Omens, curses, and whispers of the end times filled hearts with dread. Daily life unraveled. Work in the fields slowed, and markets emptied as people sought refuge in isolation. The old rhythms of planting and harvest were disrupted, and hunger soon followed the plague's devastation. The manor, too, felt the strain as laborers perished and taxes went unpaid, unraveling the delicate balance between lord and peasant. In these dark times, the villagers clung to any glimmer of hope. Herbal remedies, charms, and prayers were administered in a desperate attempt to hold back the inevitable. Storytellers spun tales of saints and miracles, trying to make sense of the senseless. Yet beneath these acts of faith and fear lay the stark truth. No one truly knew how to fight the Black Death, and survival was often a matter of chance. The plague's shadow would fall over France for years to come, reshaping society in ways unimaginable. But in those early days of whispered rumors and mounting deaths, the village was a place where hope flickered faintly in the cold, dark grip of fear. To live through such a time was to confront the fragile, terrifying nature of life itself, and to understand deeply why you wouldn't last a day without resilience, faith, and an enduring will to survive. Childhood in feudal France, work, play, and hard lessons. In the sprawling tapestry of feudal France, childhood was a brief and fragile interlude, overshadowed by the relentless demands of survival. For the peasant children born into the manor's domain, life began not with carefree innocence, but with the immediate pull of labor and responsibility. From the moment their small bodies could stagger on unsteady legs, they were drawn into the world of work, an apprenticeship to hardship that left little room for prolonged play or schooling. Dawn for a peasant child meant rising with the household, the cold, rough straw of the shared hut pressing against their backs as the faint light seeped through cracks in the walls. Before the sun fully climbed the sky, even the youngest were expected to contribute, whether gathering kindling, feeding animals, or helping with the endless chores that kept the manor's wheels turning. Education, as understood in modern terms, was a luxury few could afford. Most learning came not from books, but from watching and imitating the adults around them. The few who glimpsed the rudiments of reading or writing did so in the shadow of the village priest, or perhaps a traveling tutor, yet this was a rare privilege. The work was relentless. Children as young as 5 or 6 carried water from wells, weeded the fields, or tended to younger siblings while their parents toiled. By age 7 or 8, many were expected to join in heavier tasks, plowing, harvesting, or repairing fences, each step deeper into the adult world of endless labor. Physical pain, exhaustion, and injury were common, but the children learned to endure silently. Their survival depended on it. The Lord's demands did not discriminate by age, and the village's precarious economy left no room for idleness. Yet, even amidst these hardships, moments of childhood joy flickered like small candles in the gloom. When the work was done or a brief lull came in the day, children found space for play, chasing each other through fields of wheat, fashioning simple toys from wood and cloth, or listening wide-eyed to tales spun by elders around the hearth. Games mimicked adult life, mock battles with sticks, pretend markets where they bartered pebbles, or the ancient dances of village festivals, where music and laughter briefly dissolved the weight of survival. These joys, however, were fleeting and tightly bound by the harsh rules of village life. Discipline was strict, often harsh, handed down by parents and overseers who knew the brutal necessity of obedience. Laziness was punished, mischief reprimanded with blows or stern warnings, for every day wasted risked the family's fragile standing. Childhood was as much about learning limits and endurance as about delight, and many never fully escaped the shadow of fear and scarcity. Nutrition was meager, and illnesses that today might be minor often proved fatal, further curtailing the carefree years. Education about hygiene or health was virtually non-existent, and small injuries or infections could spiral into life-threatening conditions. Yet resilience grew in this crucible. Children learned early how to navigate the dangers around them, from handling sharp tools to recognizing wild plants, from avoiding the wrath of the Lord's bailiff to bargaining with market traders. The influence of the manners hierarchy shaped every aspect of childhood. Sons might be groomed for eventual service as laborers, craftsmen, or even soldiers, depending on family standing and opportunity. Daughters, meanwhile, prepared for a lifetime of domestic work, helping their mothers with cooking, spinning, and sewing, while also caring for younger siblings and the household's small livestock. Marriage was a looming prospect, often arranged to strengthen family ties or economic survival rather than romantic choice, and the transition from childhood to adulthood was swift and merciless. Yet, despite the relentless demands, children formed bonds of solidarity and friendship that sustained them. They shared whispered secrets, exchanged small tokens, and found comfort in companionship amid the uncertainty. These relationships became a vital refuge, a humanizing force in a world otherwise ruled by toil and deprivation. Reflecting on the life of a child in feudal France reveals the stark truth of their existence, one shaped less by innocence and more by endurance. Their days were a continuous lesson in the balance between survival and fleeting joy, between obedience and dreams, between the harsh realities imposed by society and the simple human need to play, explore, and imagine. To live through such a childhood was to acquire a toughness and wisdom that modern sensibilities can scarcely imagine, and to understand deeply why many would not last a day without such grit and resilience. The village blacksmith, sparks and sweat in the forge. Step closer to the blacksmith's forge, and the first thing that assaults your senses is the heat, an oppressive, unyielding wave radiating from the roaring fire within the stone hearth. The air is thick with smoke, soot, and the sharp metallic tang of burning coal. It clings to your skin, mixes with sweat, and settles into every corner of the small workshop that seems perpetually shrouded in haze. The forge is the heart of the village's survival, a place where iron is transformed by skill and brute force into tools, weapons, and the very implements of daily life. Marriage and family life, love and duty in the feudal village. In the slow rhythm of feudal village life, marriage was never just about love. It was a complex weave of duty, survival, and social expectation that shaped the very fabric of the community. From the moment a young peasant girl was deemed ready, often as early as her early teens, her future was quietly set on a path dictated less by choice and more by necessity. The village's welfare, the family's standing, and the Lord's interests all played unseen roles in the union that would bind two lives together. Marriage was less a private affair and more a public contract, a solemn pact witnessed not only by families but by the entire village, church officials, and the Lord's representatives. It was an arrangement meant to secure labor, produce heirs, and maintain social order. Unlike the romantic ideals of later centuries, feudal unions were practical, formed to create stability amid the harsh uncertainties of medieval life. Affection, when it blossomed, was often a quiet gift, a rare bloom nurtured in the shadows of obligation. The rituals of marriage were firmly rooted in the church, whose sacred ceremonies sanctified the union and wove it into the spiritual tapestry of the community. The village church, with its austere stone walls and flickering candlelight, was the setting where vows were exchanged, blessings bestowed, and the couple was bound before God. The priest's voice carried the weight of divine authority, underscoring the seriousness of this lifelong bond. To break these vows was unthinkable, risking not only social exile but eternal damnation. For peasants, marriage also meant the merging of labor and resources. Farms, livestock, and homes were shared as two families intertwined to survive the relentless demands of the land and the Lord's taxes. Children, often many, were both blessings and burdens, helping hands in the fields but also mouths to feed. Each birth carried hope for continuity, a future generation to bear the weight of toil and tradition. Yet childbirth was perilous. Many women faced the risk of death in labor, a harsh reminder of the fragility of life beneath the medieval sun. Love, though not always the reason for marriage, was not absent from these unions. Quiet moments of tenderness could be found in shared hardship, a gentle touch during a cold night, a stolen smile in the fields, the mutual care that grew from years of partnership. Yet, passion was often tempered by the ever-present realities of survival. Husbands and wives lived within tight social constraints, their roles well-defined and often unforgiving. The man was the protector and provider, tasked with hard labor and guarding the family from external threats. The woman, equally vital, managed the household, bore and raised children, and tended the garden and animals, all while navigating the strict moral codes imposed by church and community. The extended family played a critical role in daily life. Grandparents, siblings, and cousins often lived nearby, forming a network of support and shared responsibility. These bonds helped soften the harshness of rural existence, providing care in illness, aid during harvest, and companionship in the long winters. Family was the primary source of identity and belonging, a refuge against the uncertainties of feudal life. Yet, family life was also marked by hardship and loss. Disease, famine, and war took their toll, leaving widows, orphans, and broken households. The death of a spouse or child plunged families into profound grief, often accompanied by increased economic hardship. Without modern medicine or social safety nets, survival often depended on the resilience of the family unit and the support of the wider village community. Social expectations around marriage and family were rigid and enforced by both church and manor authorities. Adultery, abandonment, or failure to produce heirs were seen as serious offenses, punishable by fines, public shame, or worse. Women, in particular, faced strict moral scrutiny and limited agency. Their lives were largely defined by their relationships to men, as daughters, wives, and mothers, and the pressure to conform to societal norms was immense. Despite these constraints, medieval village life was not devoid of celebration. Weddings were rare but joyous occasions, moments when the entire village gathered to feast, dance, and share in the hope of new beginnings. These communal events reinforced bonds, lifted spirits, and temporarily eased the weight of daily toil. Songs, stories, and simple gifts marked the passage from one phase of life to another, connecting individuals to the larger cycles of the year and the enduring traditions of the land. In reflecting on marriage and family in feudal France, it becomes clear how deeply intertwined love, duty, and survival were. To last a day or a lifetime in this world required not only physical strength, but an acceptance of roles and responsibilities that often left little room for personal freedom. The bonds formed were at once fragile and enduring, shaped by a harsh reality, yet marked by moments of quiet grace. Without understanding this delicate balance, one could not hope to navigate the complex social tapestry of the medieval village, where every marriage was both a personal story and a chapter in the greater saga of feudal life. Inside, the blacksmith stands at the center of this furnace, his broad shoulders slick with sweat beneath a heavy leather apron. His face is streaked with soot and glowing red from the fire's heat, eyes sharp and focused as he hammers a glowing piece of iron on the anvil. The rhythm of hammer striking metal is relentless, ringing out in short bursts and echoes that reverberate through the wooden beams overhead. Each strike shapes the hot iron, flattening, bending, cutting, while sparks fly like fireflies fleeing into the gloom. This dance of flame and metal is both brutal and precise, a craft honed over years of apprenticeship and tireless labor. The blacksmith's forge was no mere workshop. It was a place of life-sustaining magic, vital to every peasant and noble alike. In an age when tools broke easily and horseshoes wore thin with each step on the rocky roads, the smith's skill was indispensable. The plowshares that tilled the stubborn earth, the sickles that reaped the ripening grain, the nails that held the timber walls together, all passed through his capable hands. Without his work, the village's fragile economy would grind to a halt, and survival would grow impossible. The smell of burning charcoal, hot iron, and sweat hung heavy in the air, mingling with the occasional sharp bite of oil and leather. Every corner of the forge bore the marks of labor: stacks of unfinished blades, buckets of water for cooling heated metal with a hiss, piles of horseshoes in varying sizes, and worn tools shaped by decades of use. The blacksmith's hammer, worn smooth by grip and countless blows, seemed like an extension of his arm, wielded with a practiced ease that disguised the immense strength behind each strike. Around the forge, the air shimmered with heat, making the edges of the room blur and dance. The only respite was the small window near the roof, where a thin shaft of daylight filtered in, illuminating swirling dust motes like tiny stars in a smoky galaxy. Outside, villagers waited patiently for their turn to have a broken plow fixed or a blade sharpened, knowing well that their fate often depended on the smith's skill and generosity. A farmer's livelihood, a soldier's safety, a bride's dowry, all could hinge on the strength of iron forged in this humble, fiery place. The blacksmith himself was a figure of mystery and respect. Though not noble by birth, his skill granted him a rare measure of influence within the manor's rigid social order. Lords sought his best blades for hunting and warfare, while peasants brought what little they could spare in exchange for repairs that might keep their tools and animals working another season. Sometimes, the smith took payments in kind, a chicken, a few eggs, or a sack of grain, making his forge a bustling hub of barter and exchange, as well as craftsmanship. The work was grueling and dangerous. Handling red-hot metal risked severe burns, and the pounding hammer could shatter unexpectedly, sending shards flying. The constant exposure to smoke and dust led many smiths to suffer chronic coughing and lung ailments. Yet, despite the toll on his body, the blacksmith persevered, driven by the essential nature of his trade and the pride of shaping raw, unyielding iron into something strong, useful, and even beautiful. As day turned to dusk, the forge's fire dimmed, casting long shadows that flickered against the walls, and the rhythmic hammering slowed to a stop. The blacksmith wiped his brow with a soot-streaked sleeve and surveyed the fruits of his labor. Freshly shaped horseshoes ready for the village's steeds, a dozen sharpened blades gleaming faintly in the dying light, and a repaired plow ready to return to the fields. These were more than tools. They were lifelines. In the quiet that followed, the blacksmith's forge remained a symbol of endurance and craft, a place where raw materials and human will collided in a fiery crucible. It was a world apart from the fields, the village square, and the manor house, yet it was inseparably linked to them all. Without the sparks and sweat forged here, life in feudal France would be unimaginable, and few would last a single day in the harsh reality of medieval survival. Nightfall and rest, sleep habits under the stars and thatched roof. As the fiery glow of the sun slipped beneath the horizon, the village slowly settled into a quiet ritual, one of winding down from a day marked by relentless toil and uncertainty. Nightfall in feudal France was not a gentle transition, but a cautious descent into darkness, where the fragile safety of the thatched roof and the close embrace of family became a fragile sanctuary against the unknown that awaited outside. The twilight hours were often long and filled with quiet activity. By the hearth, families gathered to share the last warmth of the fire, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls. Smoke curled upward through the small chimney or gaps in the roof, mingling with the damp chill that crept in through cracks and loose thatch. The air was heavy with the scent of burning wood, stale straw, and the faint earthy aroma of worn leather and woolen garments. Evening meals were modest, often a simple stew thickened with the scant vegetables or grains harvested from the field. Children sat close to their parents, weary eyes reflecting the glow of embers, while elders murmured prayers or told stories, passed down through generations. These tales, rich with lessons and superstition, helped stitch the fabric of community together, weaving a fragile sense of comfort in a world that often offered little certainty. When the hearth's warmth dwindled and the meal was done, preparation for rest began. Sleep was precious but hard-earned, a brief refuge from the constant demands of survival. Beds were rudimentary, a mattress of straw or rushes, covered with worn linen or wool blankets, often shared by several family members. The cold, damp air that seeped through the walls and roof was an ever-present challenge, making warmth a rare luxury. To keep cold at bay, families huddled together, their breath misting in the chilly air, their bodies a fragile barrier against the creeping night. For many, sleep was a light, interrupted state. The sounds of the village at rest were far from silent, branches scraping against thatch in the wind, the distant howl of wolves, the mournful cry of an owl, and the restless stirring of small animals in the underbrush. Inside, the crackling embers might spark occasional flickers of warmth, but the chill persisted, seeping into bones and dreams alike. Nightmares were common, born of hunger, fear, and the ever-present dangers lurking beyond the village bounds. The darkness seemed alive with threats. Superstitions whispered of witches, curses, and restless spirits that roamed the woods and fields. Such fears shaped the ways villagers prepared for the night. Charms hung by doors, crosses carefully placed on windowsills, and whispered prayers uttered just before sleep took hold. Despite these challenges, the night was also a time of rest and quiet restoration. The human body, worn from hours of hard labor, plowing, harvesting, tending animals, and repairing the humble home, demanded these hours of recovery. Without sufficient sleep, the next day's burdens would become unbearable, threatening the delicate balance of survival. The village itself seemed to breathe in this shared pause. Under the vast canopy of stars, the sounds softened. Even the animals grew still. For those lucky enough, the cool night air carried a subtle peace, a promise that the dawn would bring a new chance, though one tempered by the relentless cycle of feudal life. Children often found sleep elusive. Their small bodies, full of nervous energy and curiosity, wrestled with fears both real and imagined. Many slept clinging to the warmth of a parent or sibling, seeking comfort in the presence of familiar breath and heartbeat. Elders, too, sometimes lay awake long after others had succumbed, their minds burdened with worries of the harvest, the health of kin, or the Lord's demands. In wealthier homes, the contrast was stark. Lords and nobles enjoyed feather-stuffed mattresses, thick curtains, and quieter chambers insulated from the weather. Their sleep was more sheltered, their nights less punctuated by the sounds of survival. For the peasant, however, every night was a test of endurance, a fragile moment caught between exhaustion and the shadows. Nightfall also marked the end of the village's social life. As darkness deepened, all work ceased, and neighbors retreated to their homes. The communal bonds that had helped in the day, shared tools, cooperative planting, collective watching over flocks, now gave way to solitude, save for the shared presence of family within the narrow walls of the hut. Yet even in this isolation, the village remained connected through shared hopes and prayers, the collective belief in a better tomorrow, the yearning for health and harvest, and the memory of loved ones gone before, all mingled in the silence. Night was a time of reflection, a space to gather strength for the challenges ahead. As sleep finally claimed the village, the fragile thatched roofs stood as silent sentinels against the cold, rain, and darkness. They sheltered dreams woven from hardship and hope alike, a reminder that to endure the harsh realities of feudal France was to live in constant balance between the forces of nature, society, and the human spirit. The dawn chorus and early chorus, awakening to the village's stirring life. As dawn's pale light brushed the thatched roofs and muddy paths of a medieval French village, life slowly stirred with no harsh alarms or hurried bustle, only the natural symphony of awakening. The soft coos of doves, the rustling wings of sparrows, and the lowing of cattle blended into the morning air, weaving a tapestry of sounds that had marked the passing of countless days. Somewhere near the edge of the village, a rooster's familiar crow split the quiet, signaling that the world was stirring and a new day of toil was beginning. Inside the cramped, timber-framed huts, families awoke from nights spent on hard straw mattresses laid atop cold earthen floors. The air was damp, heavy with the lingering chill of night, seeping through cracks in the wooden walls. Peasant men, women, and children stretched tired limbs, rubbing sleep from bleary eyes, while the coarse fabric of homespun clothing rustled softly. Wooden clogs thudded on uneven floors as the household prepared to face another relentless cycle of labor. This was not a slow awakening, but a somber acceptance of the day's weight. Before the sun had fully risen, the village was already alive with early chores. The women, who bore the brunt of domestic duties, moved with practiced efficiency. They gathered buckets and clay pots, their hands roughened by years of work, and made their way to the well, the only source of clean water. The sound of metal scraping stone echoed as they lowered and raised heavy buckets, fetching the precious liquid needed for cooking, washing, and feeding livestock. Nearby, Goats and sheep stirred in their pens, bleating softly, waiting to be milked. The rhythmic squeezing of udders filled the cool morning air, a sound both mundane and vital for families who relied on every drop of nourishment. Chickens scratched through the dirt, their sharp clucks a steady backdrop as men prepared tools for the fields. The blacksmith's hammer would soon ring out, shaping iron that kept plows and carts in motion. Young boys, barely past infancy, watched wide-eyed but were already expected to help with smaller tasks, gathering kindling, feeding younger animals, or sweeping the yard. School was a luxury few peasant children knew. Their education was the harsh tutelage of survival. Breakfast was often a simple, hurried affair, if it happened at all before labor began. Watery gruel or stale bread might fill a hollow stomach, but the hunger for rest and warmth was often greater. There was no time for idle comfort, no space for leisure in a life bound by the demands of seasons, soil, and the ever-watchful Lord. As the village awoke fully and the sun crept higher, the sense of community intertwined with individual struggle. Each person carried the weight of survival, like aware that their efforts fed not only their families, but also filled the Lord's granaries and paid the church's tithes. The land demanded endless toil, and the day stretched ahead as a long, unyielding road with no promise of ease. Yet within this routine, there was a quiet resilience. The familiar tasks, though exhausting, were a rhythm that defined existence. The village's heartbeat was the low murmur of voices exchanging greetings, the clatter of tools, the occasional laughter of children chasing one another through muddy lanes. These moments of shared humanity flickered like small flames against the cold reality of hardship. This dawn chorus was not merely the start of a day. It was a ritual of endurance, a reminder that despite the grinding difficulties, life went on. The village stirred awake not because it had to, but because it must. And for anyone unprepared for this life, anyone unfamiliar with the cold, the hunger, and the ceaseless labor, this quiet, unvarnished morning would be an unforgiving welcome to a world where survival was itself an act of courage. The early light cast long shadows over furrowed fields and worn faces, marking time in a cycle as old as the land itself. In those stirring moments before the full sun claimed the sky, the village held its breath, poised between night's fragile peace and the day's relentless demands. It was here, in the hush of first light, that the unspoken truth of feudal life was most clear. Every day was a battle, and every dawn was a victory, no matter how small. The role of women in the village, strength behind the scenes. In the quiet dawn of a feudal village, as the first faint light crept over the thatched roofs, the women were already awake, long before the men pulled their plows through the heavy soil or the children stirred from their restless sleep. For these women, the day was not marked by the changing sky, but by a relentless cycle of tasks that stretched from before sunrise to long after the village had fallen silent. While the lords and knights might have been chronicled in the annals of history, the unseen strength of peasant women was the true foundation upon which village life depended. These women were the uncelebrated engines of survival. Their hands, calloused from spinning wool into thread, shaping loaves of coarse bread, and mending tattered garments, held together the fragile fabric of a household. The spinning wheel's slow, steady whir was a constant companion in the dim corners of huts, transforming raw fleece gathered from sheep into yarn, thread that would be woven into cloth for clothing that had to endure years of wear and harsh seasons. There was no room for vanity or leisure. Every stitch repaired was a necessary patch that kept a family clothed through the biting cold. The morning chores were a marathon rather than a sprint. Before the men headed to the fields, women carried water from the well, balancing heavy buckets with practiced grace. Their backs bent under the weight of firewood gathered from nearby woods, the same branches that would warm the hearth and cook the scant meals. In the kitchen, often little more than a hearth in a dirt-floored room, they coaxed flavor and sustenance from thin gruel or root vegetables, carefully rationing every scrap. Salt was a rare and precious commodity used sparingly to preserve meat or flavor bread, and its absence was felt deeply in every meal. Beyond domestic tasks, women tended to the livestock with a tenderness born of necessity. Goats, Chickens and pigs were not only sources of food, but also family assets, representing small fortunes that could be lost to disease or theft. Milking goats at dawn, collecting eggs, cleaning pens. These duties demanded early rising and constant attention. Children, many too young to understand the harshness of their world, clung to their mothers as both nurturers and disciplinarians. The infant's cries were met with soothing hands, even as a mother's mind raced with worries of the next day's burdens. The resilience of these women was forged in the daily grind, but also in the weight of social expectations. Marriage was not just a union of hearts, but a contract of duty and survival, where bearing children was paramount, despite the dangers of childbirth and the ever-present threat of illness. Widows or unmarried women faced precarious futures, often forced to rely on relatives or charity in a society where independence was a scarce gift. Yet within these constraints, women built networks of support, sharing knowledge of herbal remedies, pooling resources during famines, and passing down stories and songs that stitched the community together. Invisible to the Lord's gaze and barely mentioned by chroniclers who favored tales of kings and battles, the labor of peasant women was the heartbeat of the village. They maintained the household economy, managed scarce resources, and ensured that families endured through drought, disease, and war. Their strength was quiet but unyielding, a constant thread woven through every hardship, every harvest, and every prayer whispered at night. To walk in the shoes of a peasant woman was to embrace a life of ceaseless work, sacrifice, and courage. They bore the burdens of survival with a steadfastness that rarely earned recognition, but was essential to the fragile existence of feudal France. Without them, the fields would lie fallow, the hearth cold, and the future uncertain. This unspoken strength was the silent engine that turned the wheels of daily life, a testament to endurance that no tax could measure and no lord could command. It was the strength behind the scenes, unyielding, enduring, and profoundly human, without which the village itself would crumble beneath the weight of its own hardships. The boundaries of the village, isolation, travel, and fear of the unknown. There was no welcome sign at the edge of the village, only the subtle shift of familiarity into something less known. Perhaps it was a thinning of the thatched rooftops, or the way the muddy path curved toward shadowed woods. For a peasant in 13th century France, the boundary of the village wasn't marked on any map, but it was understood, deep in the bones. Beyond the hedges and fallow fields lay the edge of the known world, and with it a silent warning: go no farther. Few peasants ever did. From cradle to grave, most people in feudal France remained within a short walking distance of where they were born. A journey of 5 miles was a considerable expedition. 10 was a rare and risky venture. Travel, as we understand it today, spontaneous, exploratory, even leisurely, was as foreign to them as flight. To leave the village was not just a physical departure. It was a break in the natural order, an act that demanded permission, purpose, and more often than not, courage. This isolation wasn't simply a matter of distance, but of danger. The world outside the village, outside the watchful eye of the manor and the church, was dense and wild. Forests stretched in tangled silence, home to more than just deer and birds. Wolves roamed there, bold in winter, hungry and quick to strike. There were stories, always stories, of travelers set upon by highwaymen, cutthroats lurking where the trees grew thick and the mud ran deep. And if the beasts and brigands didn't get you, superstition might. Spirits of the lost, wandering souls, vengeful fairies, or cursed groves where no cross was carried. For many, these fears felt as real as any sword. The roads, such as they were, did little to comfort travelers. Most were not paved, but packed earth rutted by cartwheels and softened to slop by rain. In dry months, dust hung in the air. In wet ones, travelers sank to the ankles. Bridges were scarce and poorly maintained, crossing rivers that flooded easily and unpredictably. Travelers risked breaking a wheel, losing a mule, or worse, being stranded with nowhere to turn. Way stations were few, and inns even fewer, unless one counted the barns of kind strangers or church houses that offered floor space to weary pilgrims. And yet, some did travel. The miller's apprentice might walk to a distant village with messages or grain. A wandering friar might pass through, speaking Latin prayers and offering sermons. Nobles and their retinues thundered past on horseback, trailing dust and disdain. Traders arrived with spices, fabrics, or tin goods, their presence fleeting and strange. These were glimpses of a wider world, enough to kindle curiosity, but not enough to invite it. For peasants, the outside was spectacle, not invitation. It confirmed what they already believed, that life beyond their boundary was more threat than promise. Permission to leave was rarely in their hands. Most peasants were tied to the land by feudal obligation. To journey beyond without cause or consent was to risk punishment, even accusation of desertion. The Lord's say was final. A peasant might request to visit a relative in another village or attend a distant fair, but the answer could just as easily be no. Movement was not a right, it was a favor granted, and grudgingly. The landscape was not free to roam, but parceled, patrolled, and owned. And so the mind adjusted to confinement. What lay beyond the ridge or across the river became dreamlike, abstract, distorted by rumor and the shifting fog of fear. Some villages developed unique customs, dialects, even folk songs that told of their isolation, not in sorrow but in resignation. The local became sacred. The old well, the tree with the split trunk, the trail to the grazing field, these were their landmarks, more fixed than any star. Peasant life turned inward, not outward. Seasons marked time, neighbors marked distance. Life was measured in steps between home, field, and church. Even those few who dared to step beyond, pilgrims en route to Chartres or Santiago, messengers or conscripts, returned changed. Some spoke of cities too crowded to breathe, of stone cathedrals so tall they scraped the sky. They told of rivers that carried boats larger than barns, and of food cooked with spices that burned the tongue. But to many villagers, these tales were met with skepticism, suspicion, or envy. There was comfort in the known, in the rhythm of village bells and the gossip of neighbors. Mystery had its place, just not here, not in the plowed furrows and thatched familiarity of the manor's domain. The psychological boundary, too, was firm. Without maps, clocks, or much education, space itself became distorted. The village wasn't a pinprick on a grand kingdom's canvas, it was the entire canvas. The horizon was close, even when it was far. The other side of the forest could have been a continent away. Foreigners, if they arrived, were not just outsiders, they were otherworldly. A man who spoke a strange dialect or wore unfamiliar boots was met with wary eyes. He could be a thief, a heretic, or a herald of change, none of which were welcome. This insularity wasn't without consequence. Innovation moved slowly through the peasant world. News of political shifts or war could take weeks to arrive, if it arrived at all. Plagues often struck with no warning, carried by traders or animals long before anyone could comprehend their origin. And yet this very slowness, this closed circle of life, gave the village a certain rhythm, a self-contained hum. It was a world without elsewhere, and for many, that was both its tragedy and its shield. To live in such isolation was to carry a kind of stillness inside, one that modern ears might struggle to hear. There were no passports or postmen, no guidebooks or inns. There was only the dirt path ahead, and the knowledge that each step beyond the boundary was a step away from safety. You wouldn't last long in feudal France, not just because of the cold or hunger, but because of this invisible wall built not of stone, but of fear, habit, and the heavy weight of unchanging place. For in that world, staying put wasn't stagnation, it was survival. The making of a serf, birth, bondage, and no way out. The moment you took your first breath in a thatched, smoky cottage somewhere in rural France, your fate was already written, not by God, nor by the stars, but by inheritance. You were born a serf, not free, not enslaved, but something in between, bonded, burdened, and accounted for. No oath was required, no ceremony held. Your father had been a serf, and that was enough. Your name would be scrawled, if it was written at all, as one more soul attached to the soil of the Lord's estate. You were not your own. To modern ears it might sound like a sentence, something cruel or unjust. But to those living under the slow, grinding rhythm of the feudal age, it was simply life. Few questioned it, and even fewer had the means to challenge it. The concept of freedom in the way we understand it wasn't part of the daily vocabulary. Survival was. So was obedience. The land shaped you, fed you, took your sweat and blood, and demanded you stay. Serfdom was hereditary bondage, not slavery. You could not be bought or sold independently of the land. But neither could you leave, marry outside the manor, change professions, or move your family without permission. The Lord's will was law, and that law held you in place like roots in the dirt. You plowed the fields, harvested the grain, built the fences, and tended the animals. In return, you kept a portion for yourself and your family. A portion. The rest went to the Lord, his barns, his granaries, his wealth. And in bad years, when the grain was thin and the hunger thick, the Lord's share remained unchanged. It began in childhood. Long before your back bent beneath a yoke or your hands blistered from the plow, you learned your place. Your parents taught you through example, not rebellion. The deference shown to the reeve, the silence before the steward, the bowed head at the manor gate. These were lessons, passed without words. You helped with small tasks, gathering firewood, herding geese, mending thatch. You were told where to go, what to say, whom to obey. And you learned quickly that questioning too much invited danger, not necessarily violence, but attention, which was rarely good. The manor was your universe. It governed not just the land, but your very existence. The seigneurial court decided disputes, levied fines, approved marriages, and even dictated who could grind grain at the mill. The mill itself was often owned by the Lord, who took a cut of every sack. The oven you baked your bread in, the Lord's. The winepress, his too. These were banal details of daily life that became binding rituals. You worked the land and then paid to use the tools that shaped its harvest. Legally, you were unfree, but not worthless. Serfs were essential. The system could not function without them. Lords needed labor, and serfs provided it in steady, seasonal cycles, plowing in spring, sowing in early summer, harvesting in autumn, and enduring the lean, frost-bitten months of winter. In return, serfs received protection, a broad, often ambiguous promise. Protection from raiders, from rival lords, from the very wilderness that surrounded the village. Protection, too, from starvation, though barely. The manor was a fortress of order in a disordered world, and within its walls, the serf had a place. There were rarely ways out. A serf could sometimes buy their freedom, manumission, but the cost was steep. The price might be paid in silver, labor, or service to the church. Some fled to cities, hoping to live undiscovered until after a year and a day they might be considered free. But the risks were enormous. Capture meant punishment. Failure meant starvation. Cities were unfamiliar, crowded, filled with guilds that looked suspiciously on outsiders. The road to freedom was real, but paved with fear and uncertainty. Religion offered little comfort in escape. The church, for all its teachings on spiritual equality, did not challenge the social order. It reinforced it. Priests taught that God had placed each man in his station and that to rebel was to sin. You were taught to be humble, to endure suffering as Christ had, and to look forward not to justice in life, but to peace in death. Heaven became the serf's final refuge, the only land not owned by a lord. And so the cycle continued. Fathers taught sons how to plant turnips in poor soil. Mothers showed daughters how to knead coarse black bread and swaddle infants in wool softened by the fire. Children grew into their roles like trees into crooked ground. There was no moment of acceptance, only the slow erosion of alternatives. You did not rise or fall in the world of the serf, you endured. Endurance became the measure of success. There were moments of light, of course. Feast days and marriages brought brief celebrations. Music and dancing echoed in courtyards worn by feet and time. A newborn child's first cry could soften even the hardest week. And yet, even these joys occurred within boundaries. Marriage required the Lord's permission. So did a son's inheritance. Even in joy, the yoke remained. Hope, if it existed, was modest. A slightly better yield. A winter not as harsh as the last. A healthy child. The bell that ordered time, hours, bells, and the rhythm of feudal life. In the absence of clocks and watches, time in the medieval village was not measured by numbers, but by sound. The rise and fall of the day was announced by the ringing of bells, iron tongues calling out across fields, cottages, and cobblestones, marking the passage of hours and shaping the very pulse of life. From the monastery's towering belfry, the tolling bell was the voice that commanded attention, that ordered work and worship, that united a dispersed and laboring population with a shared rhythm as ancient and steady as the sun's journey across the sky. Before dawn, when the world was still thick with night's hush, the first bell tolled softly. It was the signal for the monks to begin their prayers. Matins, a call to spiritual vigilance that echoed over the village rooftops and reached even the furthest field hand stirring under a woolen blanket. This early sound was more than ritual. It was a reminder that even the dark hours belonged to the domain of time, that every moment had its place in the divine order. For the peasants, hearing the bell meant it was nearly time to rise, to dress, to prepare the day's labor. As the sun climbed, bells marked other canonical hours. Prime, terce, sext, none, each ringing a distinct pattern, each inviting a pause in the work. These were not just spiritual markers, but practical ones. At prime, a bell might call for a moment to eat, to rest briefly, to look up from plowing or tending sheep. At sext, the midday bell tolled through the warm air, signaling the need for food and fellowship, a break from the relentless toil. The repetition of these sounds gave the village a measured cadence. Without watches to glance at, peasants knew the day's progress by the familiar chimes that drifted from the church steeple. The village bell was also the herald of communal life's many events. It rang out to announce weddings, summoning neighbors to gather in celebration. It tolled solemnly for funerals, mourning the passage of a soul and reminding all of life's fragile temporality. It rang alarms too, sharp and urgent, warning of fire, invasion, or disaster. In these sounds lay a language understood by all, a code that knit the community tightly together through shared experience and knowledge. This auditory calendar was as reliable as the rising and setting of the sun. The flow of labor, planting, tending, harvesting, followed the bell's voice as much as the season's slow turn. When the bell rang for vespers at evening, signaling the close of the workday, peasants laid down their tools and turned toward home, to supper and family. Night was not simply a shadowed absence of day, but a time marked by the bell's call to compline, a final prayer before sleep, a closing of the daily cycle. The bell's sound was not just functional, it was deeply sensory and immersive. Its resonance traveled across the village like a living thing, vibrating through timber frames and thatched roofs, mingling with the scent of earth and wood smoke, weaving into the conversations of market days and the hush of Sunday sermons. To hear the bell was to feel connected, anchored in place and time. It gave form to the invisible flow of hours and seasons, translating the intangible into a communal heartbeat. For villagers, the bell was king. Without the luxury of personal timepieces, the sound was their sole guide through days of hard labor and simple joys. It was a reminder that life was ordered, meaningful, and shared, a sacred rhythm echoing from the monastery and church to every corner of the manor. The bell's voice was eternal, ringing through centuries to mark the passage not just of time, but of generations. In feudal France, where so much was uncertain and harsh, the ringing bell offered constancy. It bound the village in a gentle but unyielding discipline, a cycle of prayer and work, of beginnings and endings that defined existence itself. And for those who lived by its toll, the bell was more than a sound. It was the very essence of time, life's steady drumbeat in a world without clocks. The reluctant soldier, when war came for the peasant. War was a distant thunder for many peasants, an ominous rumble that echoed beyond the horizons of their daily lives. Most never dreamed they would hold a sword or don a helmet, yet war had a way of finding them, dragging them into its brutal orbit, whether they wished it or not. In the feudal order, lords were bound by oaths of military service to their kings and higher nobles. When the horn sounded or the summons came, these lords often looked to the village for the able-bodied men who could wield crude weapons and march into battles far from home, for causes they neither understood nor chose. For a peasant, conscription was an unwelcome shadow creeping over the small rhythms of their life. One morning, the quiet fields and the steady rhythm of toil could be shattered by the arrival of a mounted knight or bailiff, calling for men to muster. There was no ceremony, no honor in this draft. Only a harsh command to leave behind the plow, the loom, the hearth, and take up a weapon cobbled together from iron scraps and rough wood. Often these weapons were pitifully inadequate. Spears with splintered shafts, swords that barely held an edge, and mismatched armor that offered little protection beyond a false sense of security. The terrified peasants marched under banners they scarcely recognized, bound to fight in wars that seemed abstract and senseless. They did not grasp the noble rivalries or territorial disputes that drove the armies onward. Their world was reduced to the relentless clatter of hooves and armor, the shouts of commanders, and the blood-soaked ground beneath their feet. Fear was a constant companion. Every sound, the clash of steel, the roar of a battle cry, the distant pounding of drums, was a harbinger of death or injury. For many, the battlefield was no place for glory, but a nightmare from which few awoke. Even those who escaped conscription were not spared war's grim toll. Armies on the move devastated the countryside like a plague. Passing soldiers, hungry and unruly, saw villages not as homes but as sources of food, wealth, and supplies. Fields were trampled, granaries emptied, livestock stolen or slaughtered for immediate survival. Homes were burned to send messages or punish rebellious peasants, leaving families destitute and starving. The peace of the village was shattered, replaced by suspicion and dread. The familiar paths became dangerous as war bands prowled like wolves. In this climate of fear, peasants learned to hide. The dense woods surrounding many villages became refuges where families fled to escape marauders and burning farms. Mothers clutched children close while fathers and brothers scouted, hoping to avoid detection. Prayers whispered in trembling voices begged for protection, for the distant knights galloping to pass them by without harm. Yet the cry of a war horn across the hills was enough to send chills through any heart, turning fertile fields into places of terror and uncertainty. War was less a tale of chivalry and valor here, and more a brutal contest for survival. The promise of glory belonged to the lords and knights who donned shining armor, but for the peasants, it was an ordeal of fear, hunger, and loss. Their names rarely appeared in chronicles, their suffering forgotten by history's grand narratives. Yet they bore the consequences, the burned fields, the lost harvests, the broken bodies and shattered families. In every war, the peasant was the reluctant soldier, thrust into a conflict not his own and left to navigate its horrors with nothing but raw courage and the hope to live another day. In summary, life in feudal France was a relentless struggle for survival, where the comforts we take for granted today were rare luxuries, and each day demanded unyielding endurance. The medieval village was the center of peasant existence, a place where harsh realities shaped every moment from dawn to dusk, and often beyond. If you think modern life is tough, imagine waking up each morning on a damp straw mattress in a cramped hut with a thatched roof that leaks whenever rain falls. The cold, the dirt, and the ever-present threat of disease were daily companions. The rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons, the sun, and the demands of the Lord's manor. Time wasn't measured by clocks, but by nature's signals, the crow of the rooster, the toll of the bell, the light creeping over fields. Each morning began with cold and exhaustion, as peasants rose before dawn to begin backbreaking work in the fields or care for livestock. The tools were crude, the soil unforgiving, and the hours long. The plow was heavy, wooden, and required oxen to pull, while the hands of the peasants were calloused and raw from constant toil. Food was simple and often meager. Breakfasts were typically watery gruel or hard, stale bread, occasionally supplemented with salted pork or wild herbs. Luxury foods, roasted meats, fine bread, and wine were reserved for the nobility, a stark reminder of the chasm between classes. Even during harvest, when the fields yielded their bounty, most peasants saw only a small fraction of the grain they worked so hard to grow. The rest was claimed by the Lord's taxes, the church's tithes, and the crown's levies. This system of taxation was crushing, leaving little for peasants to sustain their families through harsh winters or poor harvests. The village church held immense power, not only as a spiritual authority, but as an economic overlord demanding regular tithes. Religion was woven deeply into everyday life, shaping fears, hopes, and social customs. Superstition flourished alongside faith, and villagers lived in constant fear of divine punishment or curses. Hygiene was minimal, and infestations of lice and fleas were common in overcrowded, damp homes. Illness spread rapidly in these conditions, with few effective remedies available. The threat of raids by bandits or attacks by wolves loomed, especially at night. A handful of villagers took turns standing watch under the cold stars, their vigilance a fragile shield against danger. Children entered a world of hard labor early, learning survival through work rather than play or schooling. Women bore an immense burden, juggling endless domestic tasks alongside fieldwork and child rearing, often without recognition. Justice was harsh and arbitrary. The manor court was ruled by the bailiff, whose punishments for minor infractions were severe and unforgiving. Fear and obedience maintained social order, but offered little comfort. Despite these hardships, village life was held together by resilience and community. The strength of women, the shared labor of harvest, and the quiet courage of those who faced night's terrors made survival possible, though far from easy. In short, feudal France was a place where comfort was scarce, danger was constant, and survival demanded more than mere will. For most peasants, lasting a day, let alone a lifetime, required a fortitude that modern sensibilities can hardly imagine. This harsh existence shaped the foundations of Europe's future, but left behind a legacy of endurance, struggle, and humanity beneath the shadows of castles and cathedrals.